Welcome to the All People podcast, where we talk all people all the time. I'm your host, Elisa Southall. My goal is to improve candidate and employee experiences as well as company cultures throughout U.S. employers. We do this by leading with empathy, diversity, inclusion, equality, teamwork, and transparency. Come on this journey with me. Hey everyone, and welcome back to an episode of All People podcast, where we talk all people all the time. I'm your host, Elisa Southall, and I am here today with Karen. I'm not going to try to pronounce Karen's last name, but I'm going to let her do that for us. Karen is with Swiftwater Life Coaching, and she and we met at a Women's Business League event, and it was really great. One of the things I'd love for her to tell us a little bit more about her business, but just to start you off, the way that she coins her business is she says, I help ambitious women of the corporate world build their careers and design their lives without sacrificing themselves. If that's not incredible, I don't know what is. Karen, tell us a little bit more about you and Swiftwater Life.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Karen Pambianchi. It is a doozy of a last name that I acquired along with my husband. The quote really does sum it up. I think what I have found, I was recently talking to someone throughout my own experience in the corporate world when I was younger and sort of finding my footing and what I wanted my career to be. In some ways, I was really good at acknowledging the things that I was willing to accept in a corporate job and the things I wasn't, and setting some boundaries. But there were also some times where I encountered situations where I really wish I'd had a resource like a life coach to support me in maybe standing up or advocating for myself a little differently, and not even in a confrontational way, but just bringing some awareness to what I wanted and why the position I was in or the organization I was at didn't align for me, to more effectively and more efficiently help me find the place where I needed to be. That being said, the work that I do with my clients doesn't always mean they're changing careers, they're changing organizations, or they're changing roles. It often is just helping them make sure that their priorities are aligned with what's really important to them so that they can thrive professionally and personally.
Yeah, and you're not the first women's coach I've had on All People podcast, but I think what's unique is every woman life coach or mentor or what have you, right? They bring a different skill set to the table, right? And so for you, you were talking about, needing that life coach, not to say, hey, you're not on the right path, but to more say, like, how do I manage what's going on, like all encompassing, right? And so when you and I have chatted, we've talked about things like how, women have a lot of stress. There's burnout, there's perfectionism, there's imposter syndrome. There's a number of different things that play into, a woman in work, right? Even in daily life. And so in terms of that stress piece, how are you helping women sort of navigate, maybe the work stress, at home stress, what all that stress, and especially if they're sort of that A type personality?
Yeah, I think that's actually a little bit of my formula, if you will, is I'm a fairly organized type A structured mind. So it's hard for me to not have that be a part of the process of how I coach someone. So that being said, I certainly don't give everyone, do these 5 things and all your stress will go away, because their stress is going to look different than mine. I think where it comes into, though, is I focus on helping them identify the root causes of the stress, and then finding tangible, small habit changes or routines to implement that feel attainable, but that will also actually address the root of the stress. So I'll give you an example. One of the clients that I've worked with had stress around logging off in the evening, right? So on the surface, it looks like I need tools to help me not connect to my devices work related in the evening. What ended up being uncovered in our discussion was that her need to be connected to work in the evening was connected to this idea she had that as a legacy member of the team who had legacy knowledge, her leadership was reflected in the time in which she took to respond, or rather the lack of time, how quickly she could respond. In her mind, she was equating to that meant I am showing my leadership and my expertise. And when we simply evaluated what it could say about her leadership if she was not the first to respond, all of a sudden the tools and habits of the iPhone features that let you not connect to your email at a certain time of day might actually work because she could understand why she was trying to connect to them. So I feel like that's sort of the differentiator for me and how I approach these stressors is we look at the stress itself. And while sure, there are some great tools and strategies to just change your routine, we also have to look at what's really driving your current routine to know if those strategies are going to be impactful in changing your routine.
Yeah, and an interesting example that you bring up, because I think, that leads to some of the other things that you talk about and that you coach on. And, I'm thinking about that going, even as women, right? We get this pressure to like, we have to be, we have to take on all these things. We have to take on all the projects, and we can't sort of say no to them because we want people to see our value, right? And if we say no to something, then we're turning down opportunity, or we're, putting ourselves in a negative light. And this is a lot of what society has dictated to us over the years, right? But, and I think that leads to some of that burnout that you coach on, is like knowing when you've taken on too much and when it's okay to say, no, I can't.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of the opportunity that coaching offers is the time and space, as simple as this sounds, to stop and just think about, what have I said yes to? What do I wish I'd say no, had said no to? How could I say no, even with my commitment, and maybe not feel like I'm letting anybody down, right? How do I transition from a yes to a no? And create the opportunity to evaluate what is on your plate and see if it really still aligns. There are some people, I think I can raise my hand that I'm guilty of this. I love doing a lot of different things. So my tendency for yes sometimes is just because I genuinely want to do all the things. But there does come a point where that leads to burnout and it's too much. So knowing how to anticipate that and how to read your bandwidth before you say yes, so you can make those choices. Or if you've already taken on too much and you're really struggling with prioritizing because you genuinely wish you could do all of those things, right? It can be a hard decision on what to let go of. And so having the time and space to evaluate that with somebody who has no agenda. I'm not a member of your PTO or that ERG at work, or that special committee for transformation at work, or all the things that you might be asked to participate in. So if you say no to them as a coach, that's okay. You can just explore what saying no would feel like and what saying yes would feel like. And I think that's something that we, particularly as women, but also just as a society, in the hustle, go culture that has come back pretty quickly after COVID, we don't give ourselves the time to reflect nearly as much as we should, I think.
Well, and I think there's a lot of strength and power in that saying no, right? So you have to understand, as you were saying, your bandwidth, and being able to say, like, I'm saying no because I can't be as effective in these other 5 things that I committed to if I say yes to you. And in return, I can't be as effective in the thing you're asking me to do because I'm committed to these other things, right? So I think there's power in that. And it comes from that dialogue perspective. If I can communicate to you why the answer is no, and maybe it's no right now, right? So that it doesn't feel so sort of just like abrupt.
Yeah. And I think you bring up such a great point. I know, being on volunteer committees myself, I always encourage people, don't say yes if you can't follow through, because it actually leads to more complexities and challenges for those that you were trying to help, by you saying yes and then not actually being able to follow through. So I think you're absolutely right. There's power in the no, but there's also a level, I think, of respect and benefit to those around you when you can be more honest with what you can take on and not. And yes, it can be hard to say no, but if you can be honest about that, then they'll find the person who can say yes and do it well. And that serves everyone better, right? Your boundaries are met, but that person that you were trying to help also gets their needs met.
And so you mentioned a key word there, boundaries, right? And so as an HR person who used to work in corporate America, right? But now is helping job seekers and helping companies, I talk about boundary setting, because one thing that we really are not taught as we go into the working world is identifying those boundaries and setting them for yourself. And so you were even talking about it in terms of like the phone and turning off email and things like that. But there are a lot of things in a work setting where we need to set a boundary, like this is past what I want to deal with, what I can deal with here, or I'm not interested in going that far in this particular situation, right? And so I think boundary setting becomes extremely important, not only in our personal lives but also in corporate America.
It absolutely does. And I think one of the things is people think of boundaries as a really confining determination, right? Like there's a box and that's my boundary. But boundaries can mean a lot of different things. And so I think sometimes a boundary might be, you have a project to work on and you're not going to change the parameters of the project, but you might have to push back and say the timeline provided for this project is not reasonable. And here's why. Here's my proposed timeline, right? Again, to your point of the dialogue becomes a really critical part of boundaries as well. So a boundary doesn't have to be I will or won't do it, or a hard and fast line of I'm here or I'm there, but it can be a more I want to say yes, and here's how I can say yes. Here are the things that need to be in place, right? Maybe it's an amount of resources for a project versus the timeline, or maybe it's the overall schedule, right? That sounds like a fantastic project for me to do it well. I can't start it for 6 weeks because of what is going on. So I think you're absolutely right that those can exist, but I also think people need to be a little bit broader about how they view boundaries. The other conversation I love to have about boundaries, particularly with leaders, is thinking about how people respect other people's boundaries. So as a leader, when you receive that feedback or pushback on someone's boundaries, being open to that dialogue, and again, needing to potentially articulate the company's values and needs that have to be met, or a critical deadline to say, well, we can't change the timeline. So what can we do to meet this project deadline, given that it doesn't seem reasonable? Or, and just open that conversation so that you're not immediately just saying, well, too bad, you have to do it anyway. Because that leaves everybody feeling really lousy, right? And so it just can really change the perspective when you think, I'm hearing a boundary from an employee or a team member, or maybe it's even not a leadership team member relationship, but a colleague to colleague relationship, and to think, how can I respect this boundary? How can we find a compromise on this boundary? Because some people might not even view those compromises and conversations as boundaries, so they might not think they need to be treated as such.
Right. Yeah. And again, it goes back to that dialogue piece. And as you were saying with the, how are other people respecting it, right? So if I am a leader and somebody comes to me and says, I can't meet this time parameter that we originally discussed, how do I offer them a resource, either a human resource, or have them take something else off of their project that they like to do less, right? Find a way to maneuver their schedule and work with them to say, okay, how is it that we support you, right? And I think we often lack that question in companies. How can I support you? Versus like, this is what we do and you need to fall in line. No, how can we support each other for the end goal that we both want to achieve, right? Because that's why we're both here.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I thought of so many elements to that question. Because when you mentioned taking something off someone's plate that they like doing less, a bandwidth conversation like that offers a great opportunity to also determine maybe there are activities we're doing that we just don't need to do at all anymore, right? Maybe there's this legacy thing that's existed and has been somebody's responsibility that we don't need to, or maybe it can be reassigned and fall to somebody at a different level or in a different department. And that offers a great conversation on overall business operations and efficiency that would potentially never have arisen if the person who was challenged with their bandwidth didn't propose that conversation and that dialogue. So I think there's a lot of layers to that, but you're right. I think it's just how can we support them? And then imagine receiving that, right? When you go to a leader and you say, this timeline doesn't work, and they offer, what can we take off your plate? What resources? Endless kind of options come on the table, and you feel that you're suddenly going to be much more motivated to take on this new project, even if it is really butting up on the line of your boundaries and your bandwidth, because you feel valued and supported. And that's a critical element, I think, too, that I hear a lot from the people that I work with is they're often trying to find ways to overcome the stress and overwhelm, because what's driving that is a feeling that they're not valued in their position, and they're just being asked to do more and more and more without any sort of recognition or appreciation even shown to them. And that becomes a vicious cycle. So not only does that person who's feeling all those things imparting boundaries support themselves, it might start to slowly shift the culture so that there's more value and appreciation in it.
Yeah. And even in terms of that stress and burnout, like you're talking, if I'm an employee living in that constant state of stress and burnout, right, I'm going to leave an organization. And then so if you have a population of employees who are constantly in that phase, you know, you're probably going to have a higher turnover rate. You're probably going to have a harder time retaining employees because they don't want to live in stress and burnout on a daily basis, particularly because they don't shut their lives off when they come to work, right? So whatever they're taking from home is coming with them, and then they're taking work back home with them, right? A lot of us we're not robots. We don't have the ability to be like powering down. Like it doesn't work that way. So, in that regard, right? It's really important that companies keep an eye on that. And I feel like you could come in as a resource to leaders and HR departments and say, in terms of like, I have partners that do these employee listening surveys, right? And maybe they get survey data and the survey data says we're all stressed and burned out. If you, Karen, she can come in and help leaders manage that process. Is that something that you could do?
Absolutely. I've started to do that a little bit already through group coaching programs. Those are a little bit more heavy on the one-on-one engagement level. They're small group conversations where employees start to realize I'm not the only one in my organization feeling this way, even if how it looks and shows up is a little bit different. So there's a lot of power in the connectivity peer-to-peer when they realize that. And it motivates them to figure out some solutions together, right? And also how to be, as we were kind of talking about, like the leaders receiving it, it also helps them just be more aware of how they're receiving their colleagues, their teams, and even how they work with their own managers in different departments. But I also think it reveals a lot of the trends that a particular organization might be experiencing and what's happening. So again, maybe the trend is I'm being asked to do more and more with little to no recognition or value, right? Or maybe the trend is promotions just take a really, really long time here. Or maybe the trend is nobody sticks around for very long. So I'm the only one with legacy knowledge and feel an obligation, right? So there could be lots of different characteristics and those trends can come out, but we start to work on an individual level for people to have those different habits and how they're leading their teams and how they're interacting and what conversations they're having. And some of it's tools and strategies on how to have hard conversations and, what those things look like. But a lot of it is that personal, like, this is what I want for my team. How am I going to impart that given my team's current landscape and current scenario?
So it sounds like you can not only do sort of this employer group coaching that the employers pay for, there might even be some opportunity to do some singular one-to-one coaching that's paid for by the employer, but then also one-to-one coaching that's paid for by, an individual, right? Is that all of what sounds right?
I feel like you just need to do all my marketing. Exactly right. I think the other part that's important to note is I really try to customize to the extent possible, right? So if an organization says we have a team that is really struggling and needs a lot of help, then we look at what those trends are and we create content that fits that team's current profile. We can also do things that are sort of broader and we say we'll pull people from across the organization in different teams and do that. But I work with the organization to see where they're feeling like they need support. And sometimes we've even done surveys. So I've had one organization, I want to say I shared almost like 10 potential topics. And she was like, I can't decide. So she sent out a survey and we picked the 2 that came back the most popular because that's the voice of the employees was where we wanted to listen in that instance and run the groups to where the employees are. But absolutely. And similarly with individual coaching, right? If we're looking at individual contributors and their performance, then we can do coaching around that. If we're looking at managers, people who are new to managing people and want to be really thoughtful and intentional about that new development of their own career and making the shift from I have to stop doing the work myself to I have to manage how work gets done. That's a big shift for people in their mindset. So we can do, training around that. So I really try to customize it so that it fits all of that, but absolutely, I can do things that where clients pay directly, organizations pay, and I can work with groups or individuals. I can also do larger sort of workshop style presentations. Those are sort of a taste of the topic. We kind of touch the surface and give everybody something to walk away with, but usually they all come back wanting to dig into it a little bit more because we never have enough time to go as in depth as we do in the other programs.
Yeah. And I think all of that is great. I mean, I think that there's a market to have each of those pieces. And, primarily I was even loving when you were talking about, training those new managers on how to relinquish some of that. Like you're no longer the doer. Now you are the people manager, right? And that's a whole different world than you're used to. And primarily because as companies, we tend, and we being the companies, tend to say, okay, we're going to promote the best thing doer and not the person who has the best people skills or who has the best people leadership abilities, right? And so they were the best thing doer, and now they have to transition from that thing doer superior to now I have to manage people, and I don't even know that I'm ready for that.
Yes, and I know we haven't delved into it, but you mentioned kind of in passing, one of the elements for people is perfectionism. And I think shifting from the thing doer to the manager is a place where that perfectionism can really show up, because suddenly your expectations of how you would execute a particular project or task, you have to now evaluate how someone else is doing it. And your parameters and expectations may be very subjective to your personal style as opposed to the stakeholder metric that's at stake for that project. And so even differentiating that and understanding as a manager what is important to evaluate in particular projects, because you're no longer the one executing it. Because I think that's a great recipe for disaster in a manager if you expect everyone to do a project exactly the same way you would do it, when so much of project-based work is subjective. Yes, we want the end goal to be the same, but there can often be a lot of different ways to get there.
Well, and that's why you have a team, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of knowledge. So that's what you want. And it brings me back to the conversation of like remote work, right? I had a manager who they couldn't work remotely. So therefore they said, well, because I'm incapable of working remotely, nobody on my team can work remotely. And I was like, you're projecting, right? Because you are incapable of that does not mean that I am incapable of that. And maybe you're then worried about how you manage that, right? Because you can't do that on your own, right? So it was interesting, particularly being in HR and having that conversation. But that goes back to the perfectionist thing for me is, a lot of times that manager was also a micromanager. And so then it leads me to think from even your perspective, are those people that are more perfectionists seeming to be more of those micromanaging style because they're trying to sort of control every piece of the process versus saying, I understand, go off and do what you were hired to do, right?
Yeah, very insightful of you to point that out. I think it can be. I think, but I also think there are other sort of not symptoms, causes sort of micromanagers. I think sometimes it can also be a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? If I'm not on this and knowing that it's happened, how does that reflect on me? So there can be, when that lack of confidence is showing up, then there's a tendency to get really into the weeds to try to compensate for that and make sure that everything's really in line. I also think sometimes it just can be that understanding of letting go of control and delegating. Sometimes people just have a hard time doing that. They don't know a world in which they can trust other people, right? That lack of trust creates a need for them to be involved that may not reflect totally on perfectionism, but absolutely, I think that perfectionism is another sort of root cause of micromanaging. And it's just so fascinating because for most of these things, which I don't think anyone is going to be shocked to hear, a great solution to a lot of these is having conversations and having open dialogue where people have the space and freedom to be a little bit honest and a little bit vulnerable. Maybe even a little bit critical if it's done correctly, right? That constructive feedback is the way we open the door for people to say, like, I've got this, and like, give me a little space, see how I do, and then we can revisit. Or I've heard some other great tips around micromanaging in particular is setting the expectation with your team. If you tend to micromanage, when you'll be looking to give feedback and how you'll give it, so that they're prepared for that and they don't feel like it's coming out of a lack of performance on their part. It's truly coming from some expectation you have as a manager that to keep an eye on things. So, but conversations and open communication is really the key. And in a culture where that's a struggle, often somebody like myself coming in from the outside creates a space where employees feel a little bit more comfortable to even almost admit to themselves what those things are, what are the things that aren't working, and explore how could I start a dialogue around this? Because just saying like to your manager who's a micromanager, I hate that you micromanage me, might not feel very good, right? Probably also not very productive. So if instead you have a space where you can say, that's what I would love to say, but I can't say that, and I don't want to say that. So how can I have a conversation around this and build some trust? And maybe that's the focus. It ends up being a focus on building a relationship and building trust, not on a dialogue around micromanaging, right? And then if that's not the solution, what are the other facets to it? Because it's all people and relationships, and we're all just humans. So it takes a lot to figure it out sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm even sitting here thinking as you're chatting about, when we think about that open communication and giving feedback, right? There are a lot of people, like you said, for yourself that are, sort of not in the realm of conflict resolution, right? They don't want to deal with conflict. They're like, keep me out of that as much as possible. But in that regard, right, there's also times when those people, you know, it's conflict, but they need to speak up in a constructive way and do so that's also professional or the boundary setting or what have you, to improve not only their experience, but to help, set an expectation or what have you. And so I think you coming in and being able to say, let's provide some tools for everybody to feel confident in delivering feedback and also receiving feedback, because oftentimes there's a lot of negative feeling around receiving feedback. And I particularly think of like when we've done leadership surveys, right? Those leaders, they get the feedback and they're like, that's not true. I'm like, whoa, 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 time out. Let's assess if everybody is saying this, is there some truth to it? And even if there's not, let's pretend like it's true. What are we going to do about this pretend truth? How do we move forward? Right. And so I think that's a good part where you can come in and sort of walk them through.
Yeah, I love that example so much about them saying, well, it's not true, but there's sort of evidence that maybe it is true. I'm working with a client and I really admire her approach because she said, I want to think about how I put myself out there so that I'm perceived the way that I intend. Because so many times, right, that leader might think that's not my intention, whatever that feedback reflected, that's not my goal, but that's the perception of their team. And so how do you create an alignment between what you actually are objectively trying to accomplish or how you want to be perceived as a leader versus what's happening? There's a discrepancy somewhere between your thought and intention and your actions. And so how do we align those? And that, I think, also changes the perspective of feedback. You're not doing something wrong. If you don't like that feedback, that's a good thing. That means we can change it. And then your team will also be happier, right? Versus if you're like, dang right, I want them to think that, that would be a very different reaction to the feedback. But I think that's part of it, is finding the alignment between how you're perceived and what you're putting out there, and are they matched? Because so many times people layer on their own assumptions or different things, and we have to be more explicit or more intentional about how we communicate with other people.
Mm. Yeah, so it all comes back to that communication piece. And we talked a little bit about that perfectionism side, but I think for me, I would love for you to share with people this imposter syndrome, right? You talk about this and we hear about this a lot online in a lot of different ways. Can you identify for me, what does that mean? What does imposter syndrome mean, right? If somebody doesn't know they have it or they think they have it.
Yeah, so there's a couple sort of different ways to explain it, but I think the simplest way is somebody is in a position that they don't feel worthy of. And so there's this tendency that they feel like they're going to be found out. So I think that perfectionism often shows up there, but also defensiveness can be a really big symptom of somebody who's experiencing imposter syndrome, because when they get any of that constructive feedback, they think it's an indication that someone's figured out they're not deserving of their position or the authority they have, or they're not capable of whatever task it is. And so they get defensive to validate that they are in fact in the right place. So I think that's the most common sort of scenario of imposter syndrome. But I think it's really anytime where you feel like where I am and what I'm doing, I don't feel like it's me, or I don't feel worthy of it or connected to it kind of accurately. And it's definitely a challenge. And it can, again, if people are showing up defensive because of it, right, then that changes how they're communicating outwardly and how people receive them. So the ripple effect of imposter syndrome can be pretty far reaching.
And I even wonder if that imposter syndrome comes from like, because I work with job seekers, right? My wheels are turning in the sense of like, is that because they've received feedback that wasn't effective? Could that be because they've had a job title that's different than their actual, like the roles that they've been performing? And so because their job titles don't align with their experiences, they're feeling like they're an imposter in that way, right? Because I feel like in those situations, those people are generally capable of doing the role because they're in it and they're doing it every day. It's just the confidence piece that is sort of missing there to say like I'm steady in my ground, you know?
Yes, absolutely. And I think to your point, there's a lot of factors on where the misalignment that might kind of initiate the imposter syndrome might come from. I think for some people, if their normal tendency level and confidence is on the lower side, then they're going to be more susceptible to that imposter syndrome because the slightest bit of feedback or indication, right, might really kind of set them in that tailspin. And for other people, it might be something more dramatic where it's maybe a really significant toxic environment, one particular leader or manager who has a really difficult style or creates a toxic culture could really create somebody who has a lot of confidence to suddenly question everything because of that. And again, that leader's behavior could be coming from all the things we've talked about, that they're overworked and bandwidth, like all these things, right? We don't know why they're striving from it, but it could be connected to that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it can come from those.
It really goes back to that quote of like, you don't know what somebody else is going through. And so like we all sort of make an assumption of like, well, they just don't like me, or like they just think I'm not good at this role. But in reality, they're doing, they're stressed and burned out and they don't know what you're feeling, right? So I think we all just make this assumption, and that's where probably that saying comes from. Um, but in terms of that imposter syndrome, so when you're coaching individuals that have this imposter syndrome, how are you helping them to sort of become more confident or feel like diminish that feeling that I'm an imposter?
Yeah. So there's a couple different strategies that I talk about. I'm probably going to forget some, but one of the ways can be to check in with sort of the stakeholders on the expectations. This is a really helpful one for perfectionists as well, but making sure that the metrics are matched up, right? Because then if you're both trying to meet the same metric, it becomes a little bit more objective as to whether you've been able to accomplish it. And if you can meet that metric, then intellectually you can start to dismantle the imposter syndrome belief. It doesn't necessarily go away everywhere, but at least on the intellectual level, you can start to do that. We have to be careful with that because then there also can be unreasonable expectations that come into play and things like that. But usually a good opportunity to have a couple of metrics around something. So key performance indicators for your position, your performance review, really looking at those and kind of evaluating against those can be a great starting point to give you some data to show that you're not that you are supposed to be in that position and that you are capable of doing it. Another one is, it sounds a little cheesy, but sort of collecting positive feedback that you get. So I actually used to do this, and I'm trying to remember where it started, but you get a kudos email from a client or a colleague, an internal client that just says, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your help on this project. Like you nailed the timeline, whatever it might say. Just kind of copy and paste those like all into a document, right? And then sure, when you're really feeling down, you can look at it and there'll be a nice boost. But I think even more, it's finding the proactive moments to look at that and remind yourself of the things that you do really well and what people keep coming to you for. I think a lot of times we only visit those documents when we're either really struggling or right, like, oh, I'm looking to get a new position or I need a recommendation or a referral, and you kind of go to the source for that. But having like a brag book, almost people call it, and then kind of referencing it. So I know it's a little cheesy, but it can be a really way to have sort of positive affirmations that you have supported people and you've had the impact that you want. So again, who you pull them from and how you collect them, that's all kind of up to you. And then I think another one is just trying to shift your focus on the things that you do really well. What are your strengths that you do feel confident in? How can you do more of those? How can you incorporate those? So maybe you have a project coming that really challenges your time management skills, but you're excellent at writing. So is there a way to focus on the writing elements of this project versus your time management, or vice versa, right? How can you really leverage the things that you're good at so that the parts that you don't feel as confident about, you can continue to work on, but you can also really focus on the parts that are really strong. So kind of leveraging and using your strengths whenever possible is another great tip.
I love that. And I know when we talked, right, my feeling was my imposter syndrome was very different than other people's. It wasn't that I didn't feel equipped or knowledgeable or that I could actually do the tasks in front of me. Mine was more so I felt like an imposter from myself, right? And so, and I'll give a little bit of context. So, being in HR, I wasn't allowed to have sort of my own opinions, my own thoughts, my own feelings, right? It was, I'm a steward of the organization whenever I'm with anybody from the organization. For me, it was like, even when I was in my lowest of lows in my life, I came into work and like, I'm like at a high because I had to be, or I couldn't show people sort of the real version of Elisa that existed because I had to put on this sort of mask, is what I was calling it. And so that to me was sort of adjacent to the imposter syndrome because I'm like, I'm not being true to myself. And that's what I felt like I couldn't do in corporate that I can do now in my own capacity.
Yeah, and I love that you shared that with me. I think it's a fascinating one. And I wonder how many people might be feeling that if they're experiencing like a change in their personal life, that they don't feel like they can bring that to work, right? Because I always think of it even growing up, like when you go to college, you get to like make a new self because you've been in a box, right? When you go to school with people for a long time, how you were in second grade, fifth grade, whatever, that's who they think you still are. And it's really hard for people to see you change like in real time. So then you go to college and you're like, now I get to be who I am today. And I almost think it's like the same idea that people might be having sort of this personal shift in themselves, whether it's, what you said of just like the separation of work and personal, or maybe even they've kind of evolved a little bit personally and they want to focus on something else, or they have a new value or a new element to their personal self to bring to work. And I think that can be really hard when people keep us in these boxes. I think you and I talked about a couple of things, which was one, maybe starting to challenge a little bit, where could you be authentic and how could you be authentic without compromising your role in the organization. So again, maybe someone comes to you around a policy and says, well, I really hate this rule. You can't say me too necessarily, right? But maybe you could simply say that you want, certainly that you understand it, but also just articulate the company's views on that rule that doesn't outwardly say, I agree with the rule. You simply defer to why the rule was in place or why the policy was created, why the policy supports the mission of the organization, what values the organization the policy upholds, without personally advocating for it. So thinking mindfully about how you support the organization if you are in a situation where maybe you don't agree with the policy that you are tasked with upholding. But I think that also introduces just some great conversations around if you don't agree with it and employees are coming to you not agreeing with it, maybe there's more to that conversation too, right? So
Absolutely. And so that for me, I was always like, I just feel like an imposter to myself, but it wasn't the actual definition of imposter syndrome. I feel like there needs to be another name for that because I can't be the only person that felt that way in general. And as you said, right, I am sort of, I'll say in my metamorphosis. I have changed. I've gone through some personal things in my life that have started to change me. And I can even see with my family, like them having some sort of like, whoa, this is a lot of change. Right. And so they don't, they're not seeing it in the same way I am, which has been incrementally. It's sort of like, but this is who you were. And it's like, but that's not who I am. Right. And so that comes up in our personal lives too.
absolutely. And I think with all of these things, it's so much of it giving yourself the space to reflect on it. I know for myself, sometimes you have this thought and you'll have it a few times, but until you say it out loud to somebody, right? It doesn't, you're like, maybe it's not really true. And so having a place to be honest and hear yourself say it, and then reflect on, is that really true or not? And if it is true, and I want it to be true, and I'm good with it being true, but I know that it comes with sort of some of these reactions and responses. I'm thinking in a very work-related situation, a woman who, due to her growing family, opted not to go for a promotion. She didn't even put her hat in the ring because she knew that it would not meet her family needs at the moment. And her big concern was the long-term impact of what people might think and whether she'd be looked over in the future. And she knew it was the right decision, but there was still sort of a grieving process for her internally to say, man, I would have always done that. And a part of her maybe still wanted to. So intellectually, it was the right decision, and she knew that, and she wasn't going to not follow it, but she needed to give herself the opportunity to process that decision, to come to terms with it and accept it. And then she was able to say, okay, now that I've made that decision, how am I going to be impactful where I am? And so I think for a lot of us with these different changes and showing up authentically, right, there's the place to process it and sort of grief sounds too negative, but really that process of coming to terms and accepting it that then allows you to focus on, okay, now I'm here, so I'm going to do something productive and impactful with it, whether that's on the personal level or the professional level.
And that's almost creating boundaries with yourself too. I mean, and I think that was one of the things I've learned through my even self-care adventures and things like that. And, like that metamorphosis I was talking about is like setting a boundary for me that's like, whoa. Like, I don't need to be doing that, because I needed that boundary to help me get through every day. And it was okay to set for myself. But I think we think of boundaries for other people, but what are the boundaries I'm setting for me so that I'm not overwhelmed and overworked and burnt out and stressed and all of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why boundaries is such a cliche word, but it also has so many sort of like limited definitions, and it really can come into play in a lot of different ways. For sure, for ourselves, for other people, but also very parameter filled ones around time, and then a lot looser ones like, I want to say yes, but these are the things I need in order to make that a yes.
Yeah. And so I know we've talked about stress, burnout, perfectionism, imposter syndrome, overwhelm, all the bits. But what other things are you coaching on? What other things are you helping people with?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit, is having newer leaders really think about how they're leading their teams. So partly making the shift from individual contributor to manager, but also I really think of it as leading by example. So being thoughtful that what they're expecting of their team, they're also doing. This has come up a lot actually in terms of sort of boundaries that managers might personally have a need to clean out their inbox over the weekend or in the evening, but they're verbally telling their team, you don't need to do that, but their actions kind of might reflect otherwise. So how are you, even if your boundaries and your goals for your team are really positive, are you having any negative behaviors that might be sending a different message that competes with that? And that can be a really challenging place for employees to be when they're hearing you say one thing, but they're watching you do something else. So helping leaders really align what they're saying and what they're doing so they can lead by example is another area that I love to work in. I also think just whenever leaders and team members are in the process of coaching in that professional personal development themselves, they're eager to think about how they can incorporate that into their teams, right? So maybe it's not necessarily hiring a coach for the whole team, but how they as a manager can sort of manage like a coach. What are the elements of coaching that they can bring into their management practice that can create opportunities for their teams to develop personally and professionally and have a little bit more time and space for some of that reflection that we've talked about so that the entire team and organization can benefit.
Awesome. And I know you focus primarily on women. Are you coaching any other genders?
Yes, I am open to coaching everyone. I think partly as a woman, right? Women are drawn to women in a lot of cases. I also, it is a little stereotypical. I will fully admit that, but in my experience, women are a lot more open to coaching. I mean, I can speak from the standpoint of my husband, who is extremely supportive of my coaching business, often will share when he has some insight gained from something I've written or shared. But I don't see him searching and finding himself a coach either, right? There's a different understanding from sort of his generation and how his work environment is. And part of that is he is, somebody who has many of the privileges that that come with his gender and all of that. So, it's interesting, but no, I've had some great clients that are men. I actually did a talk on imposter syndrome for an industry association, and we had a mixed room of men and women. And I just made a note to observe the different interactions, and I was pleasantly surprised that the interactions were nearly equal from the men and the women. scenarios and engagement. So I would love to expand the offerings to include that. But I know a lot of the women's ERGs are eager for this type of content in their programming. So that's also where I've kind of been focused more on women when I'm working with women's organizations.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to hear sort of your thought. And it was interesting that you referenced the privilege piece, and I agree with that in some cases. But also that there are some times where the reactions are equal depending on the experience that's being had. And so the other thing I was thinking while you were talking too is, really in terms of that woman coaching, are you also helping maybe some of those younger generations who are, sort of coming into the workforce and helping them navigate what that's going to look like, right?
Yeah, I think it's such a great place to be. I actually started my coaching with students. That was how I started my coaching before I had my own coaching practice. And I think with a lot of the things we work on in coaching, the idea is to be more intentional and more proactive and a little less reactive. So starting with people who are earlier in their career is such a proactive step to help them think about, maybe I don't have the demands of a family or the demands of aging parents or the demands of, a big volunteer role because they haven't developed that part of their life yet, right? But if they can still be thinking and thoughtful about the boundaries that they need in place between their work and their personal life, or those sorts of elements, then they're going to be better equipped as those things, crop up in their life and become a part of their life on how to deal with them. I think a lot of the women that I see are further along in their careers and further along in their personal lives, such that they've just fallen into this place of overwhelm and a full plate. And now they're trying to dissect and moderate that versus being more thoughtful about how it starts. So I absolutely would love to work with that. I actually have an organization. I don't know if we're going to get to work together, but it's their Young Professionals ERG. And what I love about theirs in particular is it's people who are just 100% newer in their career and being thoughtful. They also incorporated, it's a nonprofit organization. So they incorporate people who are moving from corporate and new to nonprofit in that category as well. So they might be further along in their overall career experience, but the nonprofit world is new. And I loved that because again, it can be thinking about, I'm new to this space. How do I want to show up in this new space that I'm a part of? And I think that can be true for lots of different transformations that we see in people's careers and personal lives too. Like some part of their life might be new. So being intentional about that new part.
That's neat. And the other thing I'll say is, for those people that are like, I'm not sure coaching is for me, or, oh, I don't need a coach. I know it all, right? I will empower you to say, or I will reach out to you and say, every great athlete in America or in the world has a coach, right? I mean, the Olympic athletes have coaches. Your professional sports athletes have coaches, right? And that's because even if you know all that you know, right, there's still some things that either you don't know or that you need support with, or that you just need somebody to be your accountability partner, whatever it is, right? So there's a reason why all of our top athletes and top professionals have coaches.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself, Lisa. I think, it's really, really true. I think one of the other things I've heard from so many clients, particularly in the corporate realm, is I don't live in the organization, so I don't have the bias. So I can bring a perspective and ask questions that are not the norm of what you hear in that daily dialogue because I am sort of removed from the scenario. And I think that can be a big part of it for a lot of people, is whether you want to call it a bird's eye view, right, or unbiased, or, certainly there's no judgment as well, but just this different perspective that can help you see your own life from a different lens. And that can be so educational and informative for you.
It certainly can be. I've had that myself. So I think that's great. How can people find you, Karen? Where can they go to find you? I'll drop all the links and put it up on a nice little view, but where can they find you? What socials are you on? How do you want them to discover you?
So full disclosure, I'm working on my social presence, not one of my strengths. LinkedIn is probably the best place. So I'm just Karen Pambianchi on LinkedIn. I haven't searched to confirm I'm the only one, but very likely I'm the only one. So I would love to meet people and connect there. Definitely, send me a message. Let me know that you listen to the podcast. I do have an Instagram and Facebook page. So I'll send you the links to both of those as well. And then my website has a lot of information on how to work with me there as well. I also would encourage people, if you have questions about coaching or want to get to know me, I would love to set up a 30-minute call. I sort of say it's like a free mini coaching session, because while we'll go through the nuts and bolts of what coaching is all about and answer those logistical questions, we can't do any of that without touching on what it is you're trying to get support on. And so that comes in the form of a little bit of mini coaching. So you get a flavor for how I approach working with clients and things like that. And I'm happy to do that with anyone that has questions at any time. So that's another way to connect with me.
That's great. And we will put up our swiftwaterlifecoach.com website for everybody that they can find you. And I end every podcast by asking every guest the same question. And my favorite poet was Maya Angelou. It has been since I started writing poetry and reading poetry. And she has this great quote. It says, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. People will never forget how you made them feel." Can you share with me a time when that has been true for you?
I can. So it was a little tricky because I really wanted to pick something super uplifting. But I think as I reflected on, again, why coaching, particularly this sort of demographic of professionals, was important to me, I had a manager in my corporate career who I was moved under this person. It wasn't that I was hired by this person, so it was sort of de facto manager. And she made me feel really, really small, really inadequate and incapable. And she did it through feedback on something that was really unconnected to the role, like not the crux of the role. And I think that is the scenario when I think of, why I do this. When somebody's in a situation like that, that's when I want to help them. Because in that moment, I felt defensive, but I also felt really, imposter syndrome showed up hugely. In hindsight, I was able to come to terms with it. That was not an environment I wanted to work in. And I therefore sought, moving on to something else in a different environment. But I have never forgotten how that made me feel. And, her name, the role, everything about it just pops right back into my brain. And so I think that quote is so impactful, because when we want to think about how we show up professionally, how is it we want to make people feel? So I love that you asked this question, because we want to be so intentional with how we want to make people feel. And are the actions and the behaviors that we're doing achieving that? Are they aligned with how we want to make people feel? Because again, in hindsight, I'm not sure that that's ever what her intention was. I think she was striving to achieve something. She knew whatever she was feeling, right? She thought this was the way to make it successful, but it really didn't achieve that at all. So an unforgettable, challenging experience, but we moved on from it, we learned from it, and here we are.
Well, and I was going to say, even though it wasn't a positive experience, sort of, that's a good example, right? But also at the same time, it sort of led you to do this, which is the best thing that you could be doing, because you're making people not have to feel that way in every situation all the time. And so kudos to you for, getting yourself out of that environment. That's always challenging, but then also, lifting yourself up and building others with you as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. And we will definitely be in touch again soon. And as I end every episode, lead with empathy, act with kindness. Have a great day, y'all. Thank you for listening to All People Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave a 5-star review. The work doesn't end here. If you want to keep the conversation going, find me on LinkedIn or Facebook, or visit my website, apeoplepartnerllc.com. Lead with empathy and act with kindness. Have a great day.